They say death is the end, but for me, it was only the beginning. The night my husband's handmade cake sent me to the grave on our 5th anniversary, I didn't know that fate would give me a second chance. Time turned back, and I was given the opportunity to uncover his betrayal. When he puts that perfect cake back on the table, beautifully decorated, with a loving look hiding criminal intent, I'll be ready. I know what I need to do. A slight tug and his flawless plan will be ruined in the blink of an eye. He doesn't realize I've already seen the future. I've felt the icy grip of death, and I'm no longer the naive woman he once fell in love with. Revenge is a dish served on an enemy's plate. I remember the moment I died, the taste of bitter almonds hidden under sweet buttercream. Daniel's smile that never reached his eyes as he nudged me to take another bite. "You like it?" he asked, watching me with an expression like a scientist observing a lab mouse. I should have realized then, but love blinded me. Our dinner, which started out as a perfect memory, soon turned into a nightmare. Carrie, our maid, decorated the table with pictures from our wedding, lit candles smelling of the sea, where he offered me his hand and heart and prepared my favorite dishes. The cake was under a silver hood. Surprise. He'd been hinting all week that he'd prepared something special. "I made it myself," he boasted, removing the lid with a triumphant gesture. The cake was flawless, white chocolate with raspberry layers decorated with edible gold. So much effort for the sake of killing me. I took the first bite and smiled across the table at him. I was still in love despite our recent fights over his late-night delays at work, a strange flavor that touched my tongue. I soon sensed something, chemical lurking beneath the sweetness before I had time to think. At that moment, Daniel received a text message and hurried into the kitchen, leaving me alone with what was already starting to happen. My vision was blurring, then a pain in my chest that swept through my entire body like a fire spreading through my veins. I dropped my wine glass, trying to get up, suddenly realizing what was happening. As I fell to the floor, Daniel came back into the kitchen with his phone in his hand. He didn't bother to help me or call an ambulance. Instead, he looked at his watch and took a picture. "The symptoms are showing up faster than I thought," he said over the phone, ignoring me. "Yes, I assure you it will look natural." I tried to tell him why this was happening, but my tongue became so heavy I couldn't utter a word. Darkness was covering my eyes, and I heard my sister Ellie's voice through the speaker. "Is everything done? Did she eat the cake?" And that was the last thing I realized before darkness swallowed everything. Death was nothing like I had imagined. There were no lights, no deceased relatives to greet me with open arms, just emptiness. And then there were fragments of what happened after I was gone. Daniel was at the funeral, suffering and sobbing in words, of course. Ellie stood beside him, supporting him, her hands lingering longer than necessary. My father, he was broken and confused, and tears stood in his eyes as he accepted their explanation that his heart had simply stopped beating. 2 weeks after the funeral, Daniel and Ellie met with my insurance agent. $5 million, paid without any investigation. They celebrated by spending the night in my bed, discussing the future my death would now bring them. They cautiously waited for the right time to begin meeting publicly. At first, no one was to suspect they were lovers. I wasn't supposed to see it all, but somehow I saw it. Each vision filled me with a rage that grew stronger each time, becoming a real force. I woke up in my bed, my heart pounding like crazy, sweat pouring down my entire body. Daniel was sleeping peacefully beside me, his arm around my waist. My alarm clock read 3:17. My phone said the anniversary was a week away. I was back, unbelievable. But yes, I was getting a second chance. The doubt was whether I should have yelled and accused him right then and there, or whether I should have kept it to myself. Though the temptation was great, something of my dead self held me back. No matter how much I knew the truth, if I revealed my cards now, he'd just find a way to kill me again, right now or later that night. I had to be smarter than that. For the next 3 days, I played the role of faithful wife, kissing him every morning, cooking his favorite meals, and listening to him lie about how he was staying late at work, all the while investigating while he was gone. The password to his laptop was the same one he'd used at the wedding. So gullible. This man planning a murder. Browser history showed search terms for non-traceable poisons and symptoms of natural cardiac arrest. He had accessed dark internet forums where he discussed a rare plant extract that caused symptoms similar to cardiac arrest. In his email, I found a receipt for the poison sent to his office. The final piece of the mosaic was found when I checked our financial records. Daniel had renewed my insurance 3 months ago, increasing the payout to $5 million. He forged my signature, and worst of all, I found a hidden folder of correspondence between him and Ellie that stretched back a full 18 months. I read every message. Every word was a knife to my heart. "She doesn't suspect a thing," Daniel wrote in the last message. "The anniversary will be perfect. She'll be so touched. I'll make the cake myself." Ellie's response stood beside him. "Just make it look natural. Her family can't afford an autopsy." Ellie, my sister. The same one I'd supported in college, helped when she was short on money, who'd lived with us for a year until she got back on her feet. The same person who introduced me to Daniel. I get it now. It all makes sense. A perfectly thought-out plan. 5 years of marriage enough to create a strong semblance of a relationship, but not so much that death would be a tragedy rather than a suspicious event. That night, as Daniel slept peacefully beside me, I weighed my options. I could run away, but that would only be delaying the inevitable. They would find me. Or worse, they'd find another victim. I could go to the police, but what could I charge them with? Screenshots of suspicious searches? That's not evidence of attempted murder. No, there was only one way forward. I needed to catch them in the act, make Daniel believe his plan was working, while I would build my trap. I knew exactly when and how he planned to kill me. I knew who was helping him. And most importantly, I knew what they didn't know. I had already survived their perfect murder. Now it was my turn to plan the perfect revenge. On the morning of the very day I went back to my past, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and rehearsed my smile. It had to be convincing. Warm enough to convince Daniel that I didn't suspect anything, but not so perfect that he wouldn't notice the oddity in his estranged wife's behavior. The woman who stared back at me from the mirror was the same woman who died, but on the inside, I was different. "You look gorgeous today," Daniel said as I walked into the kitchen. He was making coffee like he always did, the same hands that used to add poison to my cake with such care. "Just experimenting a little with my makeup," I replied, accepting the cup. Pretending to drink, I watched him. Was he always this calculating, or had I just not noticed it before? When he left for work, I continued my search. This time I checked his desk and found a small vial labeled sample, hidden in a box of cufflinks. I took a picture of it without touching it. It was probably the same poison he was going to use, but I needed more proof. That same day, I spilled coffee on my laptop and asked Daniel for it while mine dried. His password manager conveniently saved all of his passwords, and I had access to all of his data. Email, bank accounts, and the shared cloud storage he shared with Ellie. "Take your time. I have a full day of meetings," he said when I asked to borrow his laptop. As soon as he left, I downloaded everything I could find. Correspondence with Ellie, discussions about their future, plans to use my insurance, complaints about my nervous habits, even conversations about how they'd rearrange the furniture when I was gone. It was all recorded on a secure disk, and I'd restored its browser history to cover my tracks. Now I needed to catch them together to see their betrayal with my own eyes. I told Daniel I was leaving for a friend's house for the evening, and I parked 3 blocks from Ellie's apartment and waited. At 7:15 p.m., his silver car pulled into the parking lot of the complex. Using my zoom lens, I snapped a few shots of their embrace. Not just the greeting of relatives, but the passionate kiss of lovers. The betrayal hit me in the heart, even though I knew it. But to see it was truly painful. I sat in the car for another 2 hours, recording their conversation through a directional microphone aimed at the partially open balcony. They discussed the details of the upcoming anniversary, the timing of the poisoning, how to create witnesses to remember how caring and loving Daniel had been, and how he should behave when he found my body. "Don't overplay your grief," Ellie advised, stroking his head. "Remember, you're shocked, but you're trying to be strong." "I've been practicing," Daniel replied, the laughter in his voice icy. "I think I'll be able to put on a convincing performance at the funeral." I nearly teared up. They rehearsed his part, planning my funeral while making love in bed. The next morning, I went to the bank and transferred half of our joint savings into my account. Just in case something went wrong with my plan, I needed funds that Daniel wouldn't be able to get. I also met with my attorney to update my will, having previously discussed with him a new form of letter that would only be opened in the event of my unexpected death. This letter contained all my suspicions about Daniel and Ellie, as well as copies of the evidence I had gathered. It was far from being proof, but at the very least it would start an investigation if I did die. The most important task was to neutralize the poison. I had to determine exactly what Daniel had bought and find a way to either neutralize it or replace it with something harmless but with the same, but non-lethal, symptoms. As he was taking a shower, I surreptitiously took a drop from the vial and took it to a chemist acquaintance of mine who once owed me a favor. "It's cognitive," she said 2 days later, her face grim. "A very toxic substance, an extract from delphinium, causes arrhythmias, numbness, and eventually heart failure. Where did you find this, as part of the research for the novel?" she asked with interest. "Yes, for a novel," I lied, trying to hide my anxiety. "But are there any compounds that can cause temporary symptoms, similar to a heart attack, but not life-threatening?" She raised her eyebrows, but didn't insist on specifics. "There are such substances. They can cause palpitations, dizziness, nausea, but won't cause lasting damage." "Thank you, that's all," I said, smiling to hide my excitement. "The victim must survive." I spent that evening searching for witnesses for my trap. My plans had to be 100% perfect, or I risked losing my last chance. I called Detective Morgan, an old friend of mine who now worked in homicide. We met at a coffee shop away from my neighborhood. "I need advice on a hypothetical situation," I began cautiously, sitting down across from him. "Hypothetical?" His gaze immediately darkened, and I realized he understood. "What if someone knows their spouse is preparing to kill them? That person has enough evidence to be sure, but not enough to present it in court." Morgan gave me a hard look. "This spouse? Isn't he your case?" "Not yet, but soon." He asked me a few questions until he realized this wasn't just a hypothetical situation. Morgan was cautious, but still agreed to help. We started working out a plan to catch Daniel and Ellie red-handed without putting me in danger. It had to be perfect. No mistake, no failure. And I knew I'd have to be a real actress to create a believable situation. "Are you really sure you're ready to go for it?" he asked when we finalized the details. "If you're in danger, use the word Rube, and I'll be there in a couple of minutes." "Don't worry, I'll be fine. I've already died once. I'm not afraid anymore." It wasn't entirely true, but at that moment, I felt I had nothing more to lose. The next morning, I sprang into action. I did everything I could to make Daniel feel that I was suspicious of him, but not in a way that he could have guessed. I began to break my usual nonchalance, leaving intentionally open tabs on my laptop with articles about famous poisoning cases. When Daniel got home, I noticed his gaze quickly dart to the screen, his eyes widening, but he didn't say anything. "Interesting article?" he asked, making no secret of his suspicion. "For my book club," I replied, shrugging my shoulders. "This month's topic is real crime." "Poisoning? Not too creepy for a book club?" His voice shook a little, and I felt his breathing become a little more intermittent. "Not at all," I replied with a smile. "Love the movie about the ladies who use poison on their husbands. Definitely don't want to get into books like that." He laughed nervously, but I could see that his face had gotten a little paler. He avoided my gaze. The next day, I left my browser open with research on the most famous poisoning cases. When Daniel came home from work, his eyes instantly noticed the screen. He closed the laptop so quickly that I could feel his anxiety. That was the moment I realized he was already nervous. Each morning, I continued to watch Daniel, and each of his behaviors became more and more tense. I purposely left the browser on my computer open so he'd notice articles about famous poisonings. In response, his face would turn pale. His breathing quickened. Every day when he left for work, I spent my time checking for new evidence, copying important documents, researching his emails, and reviewing his texting history with Ellie. One day, I accidentally ran into him at our house. Daniel was trying to hide something in his desk, but I noticed a small vial labeled sample, hidden among other things. It was the poison he planned to use. Before he could notice me, I quickly took a picture of the ampule without touching it. Then I transferred the money into my bank account so I would have a financial cushion in case the plan went wrong. And I took another important step. I visited my attorney and updated my will. It stated that I was leaving a letter to be opened only in the event of my unexpected death. This letter contained all my suspicions about Daniel and Ellie, as well as evidence of their criminal connection. With all the paperwork in order, I prepared my last part of the plan. I got information on how to neutralize the poison and found a safe substitute. These steps helped me solidify my resolve despite the fear that was inside of me. I knew that if I didn't catch them red-handed, they would go unpunished. I couldn't let that happen. That evening, I called Detective Morgan and we met at the cafe. My words, of course, couldn't just be hypothetical. What if someone already knows his spouse wants to kill him and that person has proof? "If you're talking about yourself, then don't lie to me," he said quietly, his face becoming serious. "You have to be careful. You can't take any chances." I nodded. He knew I had already gone too far. We went over the details of the plan. It was important to catch them red-handed, but to do it in such a way that they wouldn't even realize I was in on it. I had to believe that everything was going according to their plan. It was the only way to get their confession. When I got home, Daniel was cooking dinner as usual. His face was tense, and he kept glancing at his watch. I knew he was getting ready for our celebration night. He didn't expect me to be preparing a substitute for his plans. I quietly went to my room and began to check my evidence. My eyes stopped on the camera I had hidden in the kitchen. It was connected to my phone. When night fell, I knew I had to act. I couldn't delay the moment any longer. With each passing day, with each passing hour, the tension became unbearable. The cake Daniel was going to serve for dinner was already in the fridge. I knew he'd put poison in the cream, and now I had to switch it up. Daniel was preparing dinner. I watched him through the camera as he set the table, arranged the candles, placed the treats. He wasn't paying attention to me. His hands were deft, but as if agitated. He was preparing it, the cake that was to be his last. I couldn't let him complete his devious scheme. "You look a little tired," he said when I returned to the kitchen. "Why don't you join me?" I smiled and replied, "Soon it'll be perfect. I'll help you with the cake." I took a knife and carefully cut one part of the cream, slipping the substitute ingredient into it. It was a risk, but I was ready. Everything depended on this moment. I knew that if I did it right, Daniel wouldn't even notice the switch. When Daniel left for a minute, I used that time to hide the poison in a safe place where he wouldn't be able to find it. He returned a few minutes later with a sullen expression on his face, as if things hadn't gone as he'd planned. When it came time to serve the cake, Daniel didn't look as calm as usual. I noticed his fingers trembling slightly as he transferred the dessert to the table. His eyes darted quickly around the room, and I knew he was expecting me to show pleasure at this culinary masterpiece, but I was prepared for the possibility that he wouldn't get what he expected. "You really don't know how much I like this idea of your surprise," I said in as soft and sincere a tone as possible. "It seems like you've done your best for both of us." "Of course," he replied with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't realize I'd already reworked his plan. Sliding my gaze over his face, I noticed his nerves were starting to take their toll on him. He couldn't hide the tension. I saw his gaze stop nervously on the cake he was preparing, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he cut a large piece and placed it on my plate. "Please try it. I made it especially for you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. It was the final trap he had prepared for me. I took the fork, smiled slightly, and took the first bite, carefully controlling my reaction. The cake was the same as the day I died. However, I could feel that something was different. The flavor was a little strange, but not like last time. I continued chewing, trying to look as if I was savoring every bite. With each movement, I could feel the poison I'd substituted begin its work. It wasn't dangerous, but it was definitely uncomfortable. Daniel looked at me expectantly, and his eyes were starting to give away his anxiety again. He noticed that I was taking my time to react, and it made his heart pound. "What do you think?" he asked with growing concern. "It's great," I replied, forcing myself not to give away any indication that I knew about his devious plan. I could feel his tension rising, and I knew I had to be careful. There was no hiding the effect the poison had had on his body. His face changed. He turned pale. His hands began to tremble slightly. After a few minutes, his breathing became noticeably intermittent, and I noticed him straining to inhale, trying to hide the symptoms. I lifted my gaze to his face, showing no concern, and noticed his tension gradually increasing. "You don't exactly look fine," I said with false concern. "Are you sure you're okay?" Daniel tried to pretend he was fine, but his eyes were darting around and his voice became strained. He jumped up to go to the bathroom, and I could feel his demeanor becoming increasingly nervous. He quickly headed for the bathroom, and I stayed quietly in place. I knew it had to end this way. When I heard his footsteps in the hallway, I knew this was the moment of truth. He probably didn't realize that the poison was already starting to take effect. I stood in anticipation, for all my preparation had come down to this one moment. Daniel went to the bathroom, but I didn't stay away. I quickly got up from my seat and followed him, trying not to make a noise. When I opened the door, I saw him kneeling by the toilet trying to calm himself down. His face was contorted in pain and his hands were shaking. He tried to grasp the basin to get up, but his legs wouldn't budge. I felt a strange satisfaction. "You don't look well, Daniel," I said in a cold tone, standing in the doorway. He turned his head and saw me. There was incomprehension and fear in his eyes. He tried to speak, but his voice sounded weak. He glanced at me, and his face grew even paler. Something's wrong," he said, his voice almost indistinguishable. "Do you want some water?" I inquired, approaching him but leaving enough distance. No. I need rescue." His voice became shaky. He tried to get up, but he could barely stay on his feet. I noticed his hands, shaking, his body trying to give off symptoms of poisoning. He leaned against the wall, and in that moment I knew the end of his plan was coming. I pulled out my phone and began to take notes. "Daniel, are you okay? Are you feeling sick?" I asked, not hiding my cold chuckle. His face began to contort in pain, and I knew that this moment was the one I had gone through everything before for. My revenge was almost complete. I stood at the bathroom door, calmly watching Daniel struggle to stay on his feet, his breathing becoming more and more rapid. There was fear in his eyes. He tried to cling to the sink, but his legs wouldn't listen. I could hear his breathing become intermittent as his fingers frantically gripped the edge of the sink. "You don't want me to call an ambulance?" I inquired with fake concern. He looked up at me, his face pale as if there was no blood left in it. Daniel's hands were shaking, his voice was slurred. He was trying to say something but couldn't. This was the moment when his fear finally consumed his confidence. "Yeah, I don't understand." His words made no sense, and I saw his body begin to lose strength. I watched as his eyes filled with panic and as he fell to his knees, trying to keep his balance. I didn't rush to help him. I stood watching his every move, enjoying the fact that he now understood what it felt like to be trapped. He was going to die from his own plan, and I was the catalyst. "You just didn't see it coming, did you?" I asked, observing his state of mind. His face changed, and I noticed his eyes widen with realization. He realized that his plan had finally worked against him. "How? You..." He wanted to continue, but again he couldn't. With each word, his voice grew weaker and weaker. I knew his body was on the verge of collapsing, and just a little more, and his heart would stop. He swayed and tried to stand up again, but immediately collapsed to the floor. His breathing became ragged and his eyes clouded over. I stepped forward to look at his face. "You can't get out of this, Daniel," I said, feeling the satisfaction building up inside me. "You were too sure of yourself." His eyes met mine. He tried to say something, but his voice trailed off, only gulping down air heavily, hoping it would save him. But I knew there was no saving him. I pulled out my phone and turned on the recorder. The camera captured his every agonizing moment, his every look of fear and realization that everything he had planned was ruined. I recorded it, unable to hide my joy, and then sent the video to my lawyer to prove his crime. Daniel was getting closer and closer to losing consciousness. His arms could no longer support his weight, and he collapsed. I continued to look at him with a cold smile as I watched his body lose vitality. When Daniel finally passed out, I calmly walked to the door and left the bathroom. I felt like I had won, but this was just the beginning. I walked out into the living room where the cake lay, which was now a punishment rather than salvation for him. I waited a little longer, letting him weaken completely before I called Morgan over. "He passed out," I said when Morgan picked up the phone. "I wrote it all down." "Are you sure?" His voice became strained. "You weren't hurt?" "Don't worry," I replied with confidence. "I'm fine, I can handle myself." A few minutes later, I heard a knock on the door. It was Morgan with several police officers. I opened the door, smiling, and walked into the room where Daniel lay, pale, unconscious. At first they thought it was just a random accident, but when they saw the video, their looks immediately changed. Morgan walked over to me. "You did the right thing, but this isn't over," he said, looking Daniel over. "You'll need to show that in court." I nodded. I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. I'd caught him, but now I had to get his crime admitted. As the police took him away, I was left standing in the doorway, feeling a powerful wave of satisfaction rise inside me. All of this was not just revenge. It was a step toward freedom, and not just for me, but for everyone who had once fallen under the power of manipulators like him. I looked around the empty room where moments ago there had been another life, a life of betrayal. But now, finally, it was all behind me. Daniel and his crimes could no longer hurt me. I walked to the kitchen, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat down at the table. The room was quiet. Now all that was left to do was wait. It had been a few days since Daniel had been arrested. He was still in the hospital under observation, and I, despite all my feelings, couldn't let go of the situation. Every cell in my body felt incredibly relieved, but at the same time there was something heavy pressing down on my chest. I sat in my chair, finishing my cold coffee, and thought about everything that had happened. It was important that all the details were followed through to the end. Morgan called me often, offering his advice, even though he recognized that the bulk of the work was already done. The video of Daniel, his condition recorded in a moment of fear and pain, all of it would become key evidence at the trial. The whole situation seemed almost like a movie. I myself couldn't believe what had happened, but I realized my life would never be the same. Even if Daniel and his girlfriend Ellie got the punishments they deserved, I couldn't go back to the way I was before their betrayal. I didn't know what to do next, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to give up. This experience had changed me, as cruel as it may sound. I was now ready to move forward for the future, and to do so with a confidence I didn't have before. The phone rang. It was the lawyer, Emma. His voice was serious. "The matter with Elisa is still unresolved." I sighed. Ellie, the sister who was also involved in this story, could be a problem. She was still at large, and I needed to make sure her actions were punished. But I had no confidence that she wouldn't start making excuses or changing her version of events. "I'm fine. What's wrong with Ellie?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "She's trying to negotiate with the prosecutor's office. But from what I understand, her attempts to get the charges dropped have been unsuccessful. There has to be more evidence." I was relieved. Even if Daniel was well on his way to being punished, Elisa was to be dealt with later. But right now, the thing to think about was myself. Emma, a woman who had survived death, now had to survive a world that didn't think to be kind to anyone who fell into its traps. As I approached the hospital, I felt a coldness that chilled me to the bone. It was stuffy inside the building, but the cold still came over me. My steps down the hallway were steady, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I still didn't believe what was happening. The thought that Daniel was still alive and under observation kept me going. I stopped in front of his room door. His room was there, and there was a guard standing next to it. I knew this was my last step before I finished this story. Morgan had warned me that the visit was dangerous, but I was prepared for any consequences. When I entered the room, Daniel was sitting on the bed. His face was scarred, but his eyes were still the same. He looked at me like he couldn't believe I was in front of him. We both realized he was on the verge of losing everything. "You came?" His voice was hoarse, broken, but you could hear the bitterness and anger in it. I stood in the doorway, unmoving, watching him. All I had to do was let him know his plans weren't working. "Have you ever wondered how we got to this point?" I said, moving to his side. Daniel looked at me with sudden interest. I could see his face change as he realized his end was near. "You could be the woman I've always dreamed of," he said, trying to regain some of his former control. But I knew it wouldn't work. All I saw in his eyes was the painful realization that he'd lost. "You did this to yourself," I replied. "You and your sister. You decided our fate on your own, and I will still be the winner." After that meeting, I left the hospital. It was the last moment I stood in front of Daniel. I was ready to start a new chapter without looking back. That life no longer existed. A few weeks passed and my thoughts began to clear. The legal proceedings with Daniel and Ellie wouldn't have been so painful if I didn't feel like the whole thing had left scars in my soul. The trial was going well, the evidence was impeccable, but something inside me was still unhappy. I realized that the case wasn't over. Daniel was still in the hospital, albeit in stable condition, and Ellie was in turn dealing with her lawyer. It was clear she wasn't going to give up either. The prosecutor informed me that she was trying to evade the charges through various schemes, but I had enough. Information to shut down all of her attempts at exoneration. Every morning I woke up feeling heavy, but now I knew for sure that the remaining steps would be mine. Morgan and I had agreed that Ellie's final exposure would happen at the trial, and I would be ready for it. There was one last important moment left to realize that everything that had been done would not go away. Not for them, and not for me. I was in a new apartment. Life was starting again, and I could feel it filling me with new energy. Everything around me was calm, but inside me, a storm was raging. I needed to complete my revenge, but not the usual revenge that everyone around me was thinking about. I wasn't going to be the manipulated woman anymore. I gathered my thoughts and went for a walk. Waiting for the trial was giving me a chance to finally reboot. This was my freedom, not just from Daniel, but from everything I had once thought was right. The time at the trial was coming up, and I knew it would be the final step. Morgan kept reminding me of the potential complications. "Don't relax," he said. "They're going to try to argue everything. Do you understand?" "I'm ready," I replied. "There will be no more mistakes." The trial started early in the morning. The building was full of people, their whispering and nervousness filling the atmosphere. But I was calm. Despite all the tension, I felt the confidence I had gained over the past weeks. I had to be steadfast and act like I had never acted before. The courtroom was full. My lawyers had prepared all the evidence that could prove that Daniel and Ellie were fully responsible for everything that had happened. Videotapes, correspondence, even testimonials. Everything was ready to expose them. When they walked in, Daniel and Ellie were surrounded by lawyers. He looked weakened, his face pale and his movements slowed, as if he had not yet recovered from what he had been through. Ellie, for her part, was holding steady, but I noticed her gaze darting around the room, trying to find a secluded spot for herself. She looked up at me and smiled with an expression like she still believed she could get away with it. But I was ready, and I knew my victory was just around the corner. "Your Honor," my attorney began, "what you have before you is not just a case, but proof that death can be used as a tool for manipulation and deception." I didn't take my eyes off Ellie and Daniel. This fight wasn't just a legal battle. It was my own personal vindication of justice. The judge was scrutinizing every detail. My attorney continued to present evidence, and the atmosphere grew more and more tense. I could hear muffled whispers behind me, but nothing could derail me. In that moment, I felt a power I hadn't possessed before. Daniel was looking at me, trying to figure out what I was planning. Ellie, for her part, never changed her confident mask. It was clear to me, however, that she was losing confidence by the minute. I knew they had lost, but now it was just a matter of waiting for the final decision. The trial dragged on for weeks, and I began to feel the tension building. Each hearing brought me closer to my goal, but also each piece of evidence presented by the prosecution added another wave of stress. However, I realized that there was no turning back. My resolve was unwavering. Daniel, sitting in the dock, looked increasingly depressed. His confidence, which had once been so prominent, dissipated with each passing day. I could see his eyes no longer looking for support in Ellie, but rather trying to find an answer as to how he was in this situation. Ellie, on the other hand, kept as calm as possible on the outside, but I noticed her hands clenching into fists as she glanced back and forth at me, her gaze growing more anxious each time. She knew her crime would not go unpunished, and every day her confidence melted. I sat in the audience holding my breath as the defense attorney continued to work on the evidence. We presented a videotape of Daniel adding poison to the cream prepared for me. We showed the correspondence between him and Ellie, their conversations about how they planned my death, how they hoped no one would suspect. All the evidence was clear and unmistakable, and finally came the moment when the prosecution began to present its closing arguments. All of the materials collected give a clear indication that here was not just an accident, but an elaborate and executed plan of murder, my lawyer said, addressing the judge. He emphasized how the trust between Daniel and I had been used against me, and how Ellie had also played a role in this tragic act. I sat in silence, not looking away from the accused. At some point, it even became hard for me to look at them. My gaze stopped on faces that had once been close to me, and now I saw only lies and betrayal in them. The judge raised his head and looked at me. He asked if I had anything I wanted to add before the court ruled. I sighed, not knowing if I should say something right now or leave it for the final words. But I realized it was time, and that I had to express my truth. "Yeah," I said, getting up from my seat. "I just want to say that I've learned a lot in these months. I'm not the same person I used to be. I won't let anyone take advantage of me. I won't stand by when it comes to life and death." I felt an inner calmness sweep over me. I was no longer a victim. I stood here as a victor, as someone who had survived and was able to overcome the most difficult moment of my life. The judge nodded and continued the hearing until he announced that it was time to begin closing arguments. I believed that the court's decision would be in my favor, and now all I had to do was wait for Daniel and Ellie to finally get what they deserved. After the trial came to a close, there was a moment of anticipation. I sat in my new apartment, feeling the night absorb the last vestiges of tension. Each day I grew stronger, despite all the moments of pain and fear I had been through. Morgan continued to support me, checking details and waiting for the verdict. He was the one who believed in me when others doubted. It was his support, his confidence that justice would be served, that gave me strength. A few days after the last court hearing, I received a message. The verdict was in. Morgan and I met to discuss the outcome. The room was quiet, but I could feel the tension building inside me. Daniel has been sentenced to 20 years in prison, Ellie to 15. Both have been found guilty of attempted murder and aiding and abetting a felony. I felt the weight of the last few weeks finally lift off my shoulders. They had received their sentences. The trial was over, but I realized it wasn't the end for me. My journey was just beginning. Though I was no longer the woman who feared the shadows of her past, I still felt like I had to keep moving forward. "You held your own with dignity," Morgan said, watching my expression. "You've gotten justice. Now you can move on." I nodded. The fate I was destined for had been rewritten. I had survived and won. Now I had to learn to live again. But now, I was ready for that. The months after the trial flew by quickly. The recovery process, though painful, was becoming part of my new reality. I began to find my place in a world that had been so foreign to me after everything that had happened. Even though I learned to be strong, it was still hard to shake off the feeling of loss. The loss of not only trust, but of an entire way of life that I had once considered the norm. I thought a lot about what was next. After Daniel and Ellie were grounded, I felt like I no longer wanted to stay in the place where it all started. And so I made the decision to move. I was looking for a house in another city, in a quieter neighborhood where no one knew me and where I could start fresh. The new house was in a quiet corner. I enjoyed the fact that I could finally get back to myself. I didn't feel fear anymore. I had learned to live for myself without regard for people's expectations and manipulations. But there were moments when the feeling of betrayal still seeped into my thoughts. It was inevitable. It was an experience I couldn't etch out of my memory. One day, while walking down the street in a new neighborhood, I met a woman who reminded me strongly of myself, but only a few months before. Her eyes were full of pain and fear, and her gait was unsure. I approached her, and though I couldn't exactly say why, I needed to talk to her. "It's going to be okay," I said as she stopped, noticing my gaze. Her face relaxed and she told me that she felt like the world was crumbling around her, that she didn't know what to do. We started talking, and after a few minutes, I realized that the woman in front of me was going through a situation similar to mine. "You're not alone," I told her, as if reminding myself. "There is a way out. You're going to be strong. Just don't give up." There was something resembling hope in her eyes, and I felt relieved. Maybe I hadn't just gotten through this, but I could help someone else. That encounter seemed like a seminal moment to me. Maybe I wasn't the only one who was suffering, and now I had the opportunity to bring hope back to those who needed it. I kept moving forward, now not just for myself, but for others as well. Daniel and Ellie were in the past, and I learned to look at my life differently. I wasn't a victim, I was a winner. And so, with each passing day, that confidence became more and more real. A few months later, I no longer felt the painful memories that haunted me in those first weeks. I still kept my distance from old friends and acquaintances, but I gradually entered a new society. I helped women in similar situations by sharing my story and giving them hope for the future. I even, started working with a few charities dedicated to supporting survivors of abuse and manipulation. Life became more balanced, although not in the same way as before. I was no longer trying to go back to my old ways. Instead, I was creating something new. One evening, as I was working on a new project, I received an email. It was from my lawyer. I opened it and began to read it. It was a notice that Ellie had filed an appeal, trying to get her sentence reduced. She claimed that she had been manipulated by Daniel. Her words were full of lies, but that didn't surprise me. Ellie had always had a way with words. This time, however, she didn't stand a chance. She could try to run away from responsibility, but all the evidence was against her. I just grinned and put the letter aside. I wasn't afraid. This was her last chance, and she had hopelessly wasted it. It occurred to me in that moment that I no longer felt the need for revenge. It didn't matter anymore. What was more important was that I had finally found peace in my heart. I was able to go through the darkest time of my life and come out of it unscathed, and now I could use my experience to help others from going through what I had gone through. Maybe that was my chance for true healing. Almost 2 years passed, and I felt more and more like I had finally found my path. Every day, step by step, I was rebuilding my life. I was no longer the woman who was dying from a poisoned pie. I had become someone new, someone who wasn't afraid to face her fears and take responsibility for her destiny. And while time has not brought me back, it has given me something more precious, inner freedom. Working with women survivors of violence became not just a job for me, but a true calling. I understood their pain because I had experienced it myself. My lectures, where I shared my story, became popular, and I met women who found hope in my words. It became my salvation, my way to not only heal, but to help others find the strength to fight back. And the more I helped others, the stronger I became. But no matter how hard I tried to distance myself from the past, it kept coming back. Not in the way I had left it, but I could still feel its shadow rolling over me at times. I realized that I couldn't run away from everything that had happened, and that my life might never be the same. However, I decided that was no reason not to move forward. I chose to live. One evening, while looking through old papers, I came across photos I had once kept in hopes of preserving memories of happier days. In one of them, Daniel and I were standing in front of our house, and his eyes were full of love. For a moment, I wondered, how could it be like this? How could I not see that darkness lurking within him? But now I knew the answer. Love isn't always real. It can be an illusion hiding a cruel truth. My face reflected in the glass, and I looked at myself. Who was I then? And who am I now? I felt something inside me change, but not in a way that I forgot, but in a way that I realized. I wasn't the girl who had lost everything. I was a woman who had found herself. I couldn't go back in time, but I could be strong in the here and now. That evening, I got a call from Morgan. He was a longtime friend of mine, supportive in more than just a professional way. "How are you?" he asked, and I could hear the concern in his voice. "Good. I think I've finally calmed down, accepted everything that happened and learned to move on." Morgan was silent for a few seconds, as if pondering my words, and then he said, quietly, "You're strong. You made it through." I smiled. Yes, I did, and I'm ready to move on. A few months later, I got another call from my lawyer. He said Ellie had finally lost all her attempts to get her sentence reduced, and now she would serve the full sentence. Her charges hadn't worked. All the witnesses confirmed that her role in planning the murder was key, and now she would not be able to get away with it. This was the final defeat for her, and I felt no joy over it. I even felt a kind of regret. Not for her fate, but for the fact that there were people in the world capable of such acts. "How are you?" the lawyer asked as we discussed the court outcome. "Fine. The case is wrapped up. They'll pay for their mistakes." But there was a certain emptiness to it. I thought I could feel relief after going through all of this, but nothing had changed. I was still just as worried about those who were suffering, those who hadn't yet realized how important it was to have the strength to recognize that their lives mattered. In those moments, I felt like I was one of those who had to keep going. I have to be the light for someone else that I once was for myself. And it was clear to me that I wasn't done yet. I went back to the old letters I left behind when things were still very different. And there I found new strength, not because I felt hate or regret, but because I realized that life goes on. And I continued on my journey. I could now say that I had truly found inner freedom. I had survived and was willing to help others survive. For those who have gone through the darkness can teach others how to step into the light. I stood on the beach, watching the waves roll leisurely onto the sand. The wind gently tugged my hair, and I felt the last vestiges of anxiety dissolve in this vast expanse. It was a place where I could be myself without looking back, without thinking about the past that had once nearly consumed me. It seemed to be here, on this shore, that I left all my fears behind. Life went on, and each new day brought something important. I learned to appreciate the moments of peace and quiet that I had missed before. I didn't feel defeated. On the contrary, I was stronger than ever. With every step I took, I confirmed to myself that my choices were my own decisions and not the result of manipulation and deception. Daniel and Ellie were a thing of the past, no matter how hard they tried to barge back into my life. The legal battle with them was over, and now I needed to get on with my life. And I began to realize that true freedom didn't lie in punishments, but in the ability to move forward without looking back. I sat on the rocks, holding a cup of hot tea, and thought about what had passed and what lay ahead. I had relived this place, all those feelings. It was all part of me now. And as difficult as it was, I was ready to begin a new phase, a journey of my own, one that had no room for those who had once tried to break me. "You're not alone." I remembered the words spoken to me by a woman I didn't know. Indeed, I could now help others, become something they could find strength and support in. I reached out to those who were going through similar experiences, those who needed to feel hope. Sometimes words are the only force that can lead a person to the light when there is only darkness around. I returned to my home, where candle lights burned cozily. Pictures hung on the walls, reminding me of every step I had taken. I was no longer the woman who was afraid to look into the eyes of traitors. I was not the woman who was manipulated. I was someone who had risen up and rediscovered my power. That evening, as I sat on the couch, holding my favorite book in my hands, I received a text from Morgan. He wrote that the final report on the court cases had arrived. Strangely, I felt no excitement. It was all wrapped up. I could worry about the verdicts, the charges, everything about that story, but I didn't feel like I needed to worry. I had already been through it all. Now I could just live. When I opened the message, there was confirmation. Ellie and Daniel would remain behind bars. Their punishments were final. Although I didn't feel triumphant, deep down I was relieved. It wasn't what had happened to them that mattered, but the fact that I could now move forward. I was no longer weighed down by the past. It was like the last leaves falling off a tree. It felt like there would be no more of those. Painful experiences. All that was left was to accept it and move on. I set my phone on the table and stood up from the couch, looking around my house. It was quiet and cozy. There was no room for fear or pain here. I felt like I was in my place in this moment. Not where I was, not the past that had hindered me for so long, but in the present where I could be me. I decided it was time for something new. I took up something I had always put off. I started writing. My story wasn't just about revenge and fighting. It was about being a free person despite everything that had happened to you. I realized that now I could share it with others. My life is not just a trauma, it's an opportunity. An opportunity for me and for those who are going through the darkness. With each word on the paper, I felt my thoughts clearing as I let go of that old fear even more. I was no longer looking back. I was looking for new paths, new horizons. I didn't need more proof. I had already proven to myself that I was strong. And most importantly, I had learned to love myself for who I am.